That is my cue to go to presenter mode. Let's see. All right, well, thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. Always fun to talk with woodland owners. So my name is Jamie Knack, and I'm an Extension Wildlife Outreach Specialist. I'm in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at UW-Madison. I guess, the other thing just to add is that part of my position, I do work with private woodland owners when it comes to their interests in attracting wildlife or managing wildlife on their properties. And so I coordinate a statewide program called the Wisconsin Coverts Project, spelled COVERTS. I'd encourage you, if you want to learn more about managing wildlife, to take a look at that workshop. It's a 3-day workshop held in Bill's neck of the woods up at Kemp Natural Resources Station in Woodruff, Wisconsin, and gets pretty in-depth about managing habitat for wildlife. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the outline I want to follow today, I'd like to talk a little bit about Wisconsin's herptile diversity and share with you some of the life histories because it does pertain to management guidelines. We'll talk about why you should think about managing for herptiles. We'll give you some ideas on how you can inventory and monitor the herptiles on your property. And then we'll talk about some guidelines for managing habitat for herptiles. So I'm using this term herptiles. Herptiles, or abbreviated herps, is the collective term for reptiles and amphibians. And in Wisconsin, we have 55 different species. In the world, there's about 18,000 different species of reptiles and amphibians. So why so few in Wisconsin? Only 55 species for our diversity. I think if we look out our windows right now, that'll probably give us a good clue as to why such low diversity here in Wisconsin. And of course, it has to do with our cold temperatures, our cold winters, snow cover, and so on. Herptiles, reptiles, and amphibians are ectothermic. That means they rely on their surrounding temperatures to control their body temperature, as opposed to birds and mammals, where we're able to regulate our own and maintain a constant internal body temperature. So ectothermic, cold-blooded, sort of means the same thing. And unique to Wisconsin herptiles, they're really only active on the landscape from about April until October.
Hey, Jamie.
Yes.
Your audio quality is kind of went down a little bit. I wonder if you turned off your camera. That would help with your signal.
I can definitely give that a try. Let's see here. All right, please let me know, Bill.
That's better.
Okay, let's just keep that off then. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the differences between reptiles and amphibians. We're going back to basic biology here, but reptiles in Wisconsin include turtles, snakes, and lizards. Amphibians include frogs, toads, and salamanders. Their differences now, reptiles have dry skin and they have scales. Amphibians have moist skin, it's semi-permeable, it appears slimy or wet, and they don't have any scales. On the reptiles, they're going to have claws. So lizards and turtles have claws. Snakes obviously don't have legs, so that they're an exception there. And then on our amphibians, our frogs and our salamanders, no claws. And then there are some differences in the eggs that are laid. Reptiles have hard-shelled eggs that are laid on land. And there's about half of our snake species that give birth to live young, so they don't lay eggs at all. On the other side, amphibians have a soft jelly-like egg. They're laid in water by most of them. And then another key difference between reptiles and amphibians is that reptile young look like miniature versions of adults. And amphibians, and if this is even in their name means both life forms or dual life, they have 2 stages. Their first stage of life is aquatic. Their second or adult stage of life is terrestrial. And we can think about the frog and the tadpole as examples of that. Because of their aquatic and terrestrial needs, they become, and their semi-permeable skin, amphibians especially are particularly sensitive and excellent indicators of ecosystem health. Now my slides, oh, there we go. Okay. In addition, there's some important life history differences between these two categories. So reptiles are slow to mature. And what we mean by that is many of the reptiles, I'll give you an example, our endangered ornate box turtle and our threatened wood turtles. It takes them anywhere from 12 to 15 years for a female to reach maturity for breeding. So they're slow to mature, low reproductive potential, so they don't lay that many eggs. They have relatively large home ranges and a pretty long lifespan. A turtle's a great example of a longer lived animal given its size. Amphibians are kind of the opposite. They're quick to mature and develop. They have high reproductive potential. A single frog can lay thousands of eggs. They have relatively small home ranges. They don't need to travel far. But on the flip side, they have relatively shorter lifespans. So when we look at reptiles and amphibians in Wisconsin, again, 55 species total, 56% of Wisconsin's reptiles are in trouble. So about 20 of the 36 compared to about 26% of the amphibians. And in total of those 55 species, 45% of our herptiles in the state are endangered, threatened, or of special concern status. So moving forward, I want to break this down a little bit. We'll talk about reptiles first. So as a reminder, those are the snakes, turtles, and lizards. And yes, we do have lizards in the state. For snakes, we have 21 species. Many of our snake populations have declined due to a loss in habitat, change in habitat use, and human persecution, probably more so than any of the other groups of reptiles that we're going to talk to. It still happens today where people don't understand or appreciate the value of snakes and continue to kill them needlessly. We have 13 species that are endangered, threatened, or of special concern. 2 venomous rattlesnakes, the timber rattlesnake and the Massasauga rattlesnake. Another biological trait to point out, snakes are related to lizards, but they do not have eyelids or ear veins. That's what makes them different. And all of our snake species are carnivores. They can eat anything, depending on the size or the species of the snake. They'll eat anything from insects to worms to slugs, amphibians, rodents, small birds, eggs, other snakes, crayfish, and even small fish. Most of the snake breeding occurs upon spring emergence from hibernation, and then there's some that breed late summer and into the fall. And as I mentioned earlier, about half of our 21 snakes lay eggs, and the other half give birth to live young. And I just wanted to show folks are generally interested in the rattlesnakes of Wisconsin. And so we have 2 species highlighted here. You can see that their distribution is pretty restricted, and they're both species of concern or threatened. It's important to note that since 1900, there's only been 1 rattlesnake related death documented in Wisconsin. So people, if they happen to get struck, which does not happen very often, are able to seek the anti-venom and be treated. So I often get the question as an extension specialist, how do you tell the difference between these 2 snakes and a completely harmless snake? And first you can think about where you're located and where you're seeing a snake on your property. You know, does the distribution of the rattlesnakes overlap with your property? Next, you can look if you see, and from a distance, of course, if you see a rattle, it is a rattlesnake. However, if you hear rattle, it could be a rattlesnake or it could be a mimic. We have a number of species, a handful of species that will actually mimic the vibrations of the rattle by vibrating their tail against the leaves or vegetation nearby. So obviously, if it has a rattle, it's a rattlesnake. The other thing would be if you look at the head especially on the timber rattlesnake, it has a lance or triangular shaped head. Another way to think about that is it has a neck, where harmless snakes are generally the same girth, all the way through that head and neck area. Rattlesnakes also tend to be heavier bodied or girthy, if you will, compared to harmless snakes that tend to be maybe a little bit leaner or uniform in size. Rattlesnakes also have heat pits, and they're located between the eyes and the nostrils, and they allow them to detect warm-blooded prey. They ambush prey as it comes by. And then I don't encourage you to get this close, but maybe you have a pair of binoculars with you, but rattlesnakes will have elliptical pupils and harmless snakes have round pupils. So again, if you happen to see a snake and you are in the geographic area, those are some tips for identifying rattlesnakes from harmless snakes. Okay, moving on. For turtles in Wisconsin, we have 11 species. 8 of them are aquatic. 2 are semi-aquatic, spend time on both land and in water. Those are our threatened and endangered, our wood turtle and our Blandings turtle. And then 1 that is strictly terrestrial, spends all of its time on land, and that's the ornate box turtle. The turtle in the upper right with the really pretty, vibrant yellow throat is a Blandings turtle. And 4 of our 11 species are of special concern, endangered, or threatened. Turtle, you might ask where the scales come from in terms of turtles being a reptile, and we know all reptiles have scales. The shell is actually composed of large scales called scutes. The top of the shell is called the carapace, and the bottom, the plastron. And then most will know that turtles love to bask in the sun, absorb that heat. That helps with regulating their body temperature. It helps them digest their food. It helps incubation of eggs, and it dries the outside of the shell to prevent or inhibit bacterial and fungal growth. Like snakes, most turtles breed in the spring after they emerge from hibernation or in August. They'll lay their eggs in a excavated nest in the uplands, and as you know, there is no parental care of that nest. They lay the nest, lay the eggs, cover them up, and leave. And depending on the species, incubation can last anywhere from 60 to 90 days. One of my favorite facts about turtles is that for most of our turtle species, the temperature of that nest or the egg that's developing inside it, the incubation temperature, will determine whether that is a male or female. So its position in the nest, warmer temperatures produce more females, while cooler temperatures produce more males. And then Wisconsin, we have the 4 lizard species that I mentioned, very limited in their distribution and population. 3 of the 4 are of concern status. They require sandy soil for burrowing and hibernating. They do lay eggs. And when seized by predators, so if they get captured by their tail, lizards can actually drop their tail and then regenerate it. And of course, there's an energetic loss there's a toll on the body that it goes through to regenerate that tail, but it is a mechanism that can save their lives. Then moving on to amphibians, again in Wisconsin, we are talking about frogs and toads. There are 12 species. And salamanders, we have 7 species. And again, the amphibians have that semi-permeable skin that needs to stay moist. They also have some skin secretions that can prevent pathogens like bacteria and mold. This is why it's important that you have moist hands when you're handling them, and you don't want to kind of remove what you might call that slime that's on them. And in some cases, these secretions can be foul tasting or toxic to help deter predation. Amphibians are going to need cool and damp places so they can avoid drying out. Many of them are nocturnal. And then again, the 2 stages, the larval stage, and then the adult or terrestrial stage. Amphibians are herbivores as larvae, but frogs and salamanders are both carnivorous as adults. So, and even bullfrogs, we could take that to the extreme. They can feed on small fish They'll even eat mammals, ducklings, young snakes, turtles, and frogs. And then unique to some of the frogs, there are at least 2 species, the spring peepers and the wood frogs, that actually overwinter by freezing solid. Their bodies produce a glycol-like antifreeze. It saturates their cells, and when the temps drop, their body fluid freezes, and they kind of stay there until spring, and then they thaw out. So a pretty cool adaptation to survive winter. So 12 species of frogs, including the American toad. So that's right. Toads are actually a subclassification of frogs, meaning that all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. There's our riddle for the day. To tell the difference between the two, toads are going to be warty looking, like the one in the lower right, covered in little bumps, generally dry, and frogs are going to be sleek and smooth, like the wood frog in the upper right. We have 3 species listed as endangered, threatened, or special concern. Our frogs are either terrestrial, spend time on the land, or arboreal, in that they like to climb or they're on trees, like the lower left, the gray tree frog. And then in the spring, when you hear frogs calling, you're actually hearing the males, and they're doing this to attract females to the breeding ponds. And not unique to frogs, but each frog species has its own unique call. So if you were to learn the 12 calls of frogs and the 1 toad in the state, you could identify them by sound only. And that'll play in a little bit later when we talk about some surveys that you can do. And then again, young hatch from eggs, and the frog larvae are often called tadpoles, or you might have heard them called pollywogs. In Wisconsin, our largest frog is the bullfrog. It can get to be 6 inches or more. And our smallest is the Blanchard cricket frog, and it's about 1 inch in size. And last but not least, salamanders, 7 species, 1 of special concern. They're pretty unknown. I guess you would not realize that we have them. They're silent, they're secretive, and they're mostly nocturnal. You can find them under logs or within logs or in the leaf litter. Our largest is actually in a completely aquatic salamander, the mud puppy, and it can get to be 12 to 16 inches. And let's see, young hatch from eggs. And same thing, come spring, as they emerge from hibernation, you'll see them traveling from hibernation areas to ponds, and that often has them crossing in mass quantities, crossing roads, and that can be an issue both for their survival and the fact that they have to travel those distances to get to breeding ponds. Okay, so with that introduction about Wisconsin's diversity of herptiles, let's talk a little bit about why you should consider managing for herptiles. Certainly, they play an important role as both predators and prey. So they help to keep a full system intact of all the wildlife. They have intrinsic or aesthetic value. You enjoy seeing the animals. They also help to maintain balance. Few examples: snakes can help to reduce disease threats like hantavirus or Lyme disease by keeping rodent populations in check. And they can also help to keep agricultural pests that consume grain in check. So they have a very important role in managing small mammal populations. And amphibians are also important predators of insects and invertebrates in both aquatic and moist terrestrial areas. And of course, I mentioned earlier about amphibians particularly being very good indicators of environmental quality. And I always love to put in this last one, but it's fun to involve kids in wildlife management or, in nature. It can be very educational, but most of these species that we're talking about, whether it's a toad or a frog or a snake, are fairly easy to find and are often the first contacts that a child may have with nature. And I can share some pictures of my own children who love to catch anything that they can. So just an example that this is a great way to make those connections with the outdoors and herptiles are an important part of that. And then, of course, another reason to manage is because herptiles really do need our help. I started at the beginning by talking about the large proportion of herptiles that are in threatened or endangered status, but these threats have come from habitat loss. So at this point, Wisconsin's lost more than 50% of our pre-settlement wetland acreage. Seasonal wetlands are one of the most important habitats for herptiles in the lands, and they've been lost in the landscape due to draining or tiling or ditching for either agriculture or development purposes. Landscape connectivity, habitat isolation, so the loss of travel corridors or ways for these populations to stay in contiguous habitat is important. We talked a little bit about the impacts of roads and trails, certainly is a concern for mortality on the roads. Use of herbicides, insecticides, and fertilizers are threats, especially again to the amphibians with that semi-permeable skin. Invasive plant species. This is on here because let's think about your woodlands. The more diverse your understory, the more diverse your cover, the more native insects that are going to be foraging, provides better habitat for herptiles as well than a monoculture of an invasive plant species, whether that be garlic mustard or buckthorn or things like that. So invasive plant species are a threat to herptiles as well. Predators and predation on nests. We can think about turtle nests like the one in the lower right. Certainly an issue for some of these species. Again, it takes a long time before they reach breeding age. And then there's no they're not defending that nest. So all of their efforts can be lost with one raccoon or dog or crow that comes through and discovers that nest. And then exploitation, removal of these animals from their native habitats, either commercially or recreationally, and both legally and illegally, can have negative consequences on their populations. And then something that is certainly being monitored and studied is what the impacts of climate change will be on herptiles. Whether we see range shifts, the timing of their breeding, prey availability, the effects of extreme weather events, or perhaps more disease in the system, all have yet to play out. All right, so I'd like to switch then into talking a little bit about what you can do to help herptiles on your property. And I'll start by, again, just reiterating that the location of your property, the size of your property, the quantity and quality of habitat that you have available, whether you already have some of these species present, and of course, what your neighbors are doing or what your surrounding landscape looks like has a lot of bearing on your herptile management options. And so, of course, it's going to involve doing some homework. I've shared some general life history information about these various species or groups, but each individual species is going to have its own unique needs, habitat needs. And you're going to want, if there's this particular species or group you're interested in, you're going to want to study up on those. And at the end of this presentation, I have a slide with a number of resources that you can refer back to in getting these, but these are three I would really encourage you to take a look at. The Amphibian and Reptile of Wisconsin is about a 4-inch book. I don't know that you want to go to that level, but it's species account. It's a newly published book on species accounts of Wisconsin herptiles. But the smaller 3-set publication series on amphibians and reptiles of Wisconsin is a great set. It's available through the Department of Natural Resources. It's $10 for the set. That would be a wonderful purchase. And when it comes to managing the Partners for Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, PARC, has habitat management guidelines for each region of the United States. And so the Midwestern United States guidebook would be a great resource for you to have as well and get more specific into management guidelines as well. And that's available as a PDF online. Again, I'll have that on the last slide. And these are some of the sources along with the DNR's website that I've used for this presentation. Another good place to start is to go to the DNR's website and look at the amphibian and reptiles of Wisconsin county record maps. So you can essentially look at each of the 55 species. Here we see blue spotted salamanders. You can actually below this, you can click on it to blow up the map and print it if you want, but you can see for the most part, blue spotted salamanders are present throughout most of Wisconsin. Spotted salamanders, you know, if you're in the southwest corner, you're probably not going to be managing for spotted salamanders, but this gives you an idea of quickly scrolling through here, what species are possible based on the location of your property. And then I also want to point out that there are regulations that regulate the capture, the possession of amphibians and reptiles in the state, and I encourage you to take a look at those. So there is a turtle season when you can capture and or harvest turtles. Of course, this does not include any of the threatened or endangered species, so this is a good brochure for you to take a look at as well. Okay, so you're doing some research, or you really don't maybe know where you want to start, but you'd like to figure out what you have on your property in terms of herptiles, and then maybe manage for them. And so we talk about inventorying and then monitoring herptiles. So inventorying is collecting baseline information about the herptiles using your property. It'll help you maybe learn and discover species that are present, but it can help guide your management actions that you take. And then monitoring is essentially repeating some of those inventory procedures so you can keep track of populations through time, and also you can use it to evaluate some of the management steps you've taken. So there's a number of different things you can do, and that publication I had on the earlier slide is also listed in resources, but you can maintain just a simple checklist. Get a notebook and keep a record of all the herptiles you see or hear between April and October each year. So just presence, absence, what you've detected on your property. You could take it a step further and use a net and dip net for amphibians. You see frogs, but you can't tell what they are. They're not singing. Try catching some of them. Or you might actually see eggs or larvae in the water. Again, you could capture that and hold it long enough to identify it. There are field guides to amphibian eggs and larvae of the Western Great Lakes that will help you determine what species that frog or toad larvae is. You could also do some more strategic sampling, whether you're looking under rotten logs, looking under rocks, and actually looking for amphibians and reptiles. You could do basking surveys where you're counting and determining the species of turtles that you have. Nest surveys of turtles, if you do have them nesting on your property, you might monitor them to see whether those nests have been successful or not. If you happen to have a snake hibernaculum, you might monitor for activity and counts at that location. And then these last three, I'm going to talk about each of them with the use of a slide. So we'll start with the frog and toad call survey. So as I mentioned earlier about frogs and toads, is each of our 12 species has a unique call. And if you learn to identify the calls, then you can learn to document what species you have without ever necessarily seeing them. And each species of frog, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, breeds at a different time throughout the summer, spring and summer. So our earliest spring calling frogs are the wood frog, the chorus frog, spring peeper, northern leopard frogs. And so we want to go out and listen in the evening for frogs calling, but we want to repeat that survey 3 times throughout the spring and summer so that we don't miss sampling frogs that are actually present on our property. And so you could take the Wisconsin Frog and Toad Call Survey Protocol and use it on your property. You don't have to submit the data per se, but it's a way to monitor for the presence and absence, which is the inventorying. And then by doing it over time, you can monitor their relative abundances. And so you visit any wetlands or water that you have on your property after dark 3 times during the calling season, as I mentioned, and you wait for a minute, and then you listen and record frogs for 3 minutes. And then you repeat it at each water body or sampling point you determine on your property. And so when you're listening, and let's say you hear spring peepers, you're trying to give that an abundance code of 1, 2, or 3. 1 means you can hear an individual, or 2 or 3, but it's very easy to pick out individuals. That would be an abundance code of 1. If you hear multiple individuals, they're overlapping each other, that's a 2. And 3 is just a full chorus of spring peepers humming along, and that would be an abundance code of 3. And so again, you do that 3 times a year, and you can kind of keep tabs on those 12, potentially 12 species. Not that you would have all of them, but that's one way to monitor frogs and toads. Another thing that you could do relatively easily is to put out cover boards on your property. And so this helps monitor, but also provide cover for terrestrial salamanders, frogs, and in some cases, snakes. And you want to use untreated sheets of 3/4 inch plywood. The treated plywood is not good for the amphibians. Again, the chemicals that are in it and their semi-permeable skin don't mix. So you want to use untreated sheets of plywood. You could also use slab wood or flat rocks. And essentially, if you're trying to sample for snakes, like in the picture to the lower right, putting those in a grassland right next to a forest would be a good spot. Snakes need the warm temperatures, and they have scales, so they're not going to dry out. So they need that heat, and they would crawl underneath that for cover. For amphibians, you want to be putting those in a closed canopy, moist, forested area. And to install them, you're going to remove any of the grass or leaf litter, kind of get down to the bare mineral soil, make it nice and level, and then place those cover boards down. Again, this is passive sampling. We're not trapping an animal in this case. So whether you ever check them or not is entirely up to you. But you're not going to harm anything by putting these out and not checking them. But you want to check them then eventually during the day, about 3 times between early spring and late fall when the temperatures are above freezing. And you essentially can capture what you might find underneath, identify it. And then the key here is to release that animal, let's say it's a salamander, next to the cover board so that they can crawl back under it without getting squished. So don't put the animal down and then set the board on top of it. Put the board down first and let the animal set the animal down right next to it, and it'll scurry back underneath. Be mindful that new cover boards that are placed, it takes a while for animals to find them, for one. But we find that the more deteriorated that plywood board, the more you'll have more capture rates as that board ages and is on the landscape for a while. And then lastly, another inventory technique you can use is to put in a pitfall trap. I will caution you, with this type of trap, you are actually live trapping the animal. And so if you decide to do this, it comes with the responsibility of checking this trap 2 times a day, or if you're only going to run it at night, you check it in the morning. If you're going to keep it open 24 hours, you would want to check it in the morning and in the evening. And it consists of locating habitat, a transitional area between a wetland and an upland, maybe deciduous forest. And you're going to want to put, you want to run that pitfall parallel to the upland and lowland habitat. And what's happening is at night, amphibians will move up to the upland area. They'll come across either a drift fence, or you can use sheets of plywood. And then they'll walk along that and drop into the hole that you've created in the ground with either 2 coffee cans taped together. If you can still find some of the metal coffee cans, you could certainly use plastic. If you're only doing a few of these, it takes a little more work, but you could do a 5-gallon bucket. But you're essentially putting that drift fence or that plywood right across the middle of that bucket. So on either side, if an amphibian or small mammal or a snake comes to that drift fence, they'll find their way into that hole. In the bottom of the bucket, it's a good idea not to have any holes in it for drainage, and then actually put a cover over it, an elevated cover. So the cover would be about the same height as the top of the drift fence itself. It allows for some shade and keeps rain out of there. And then you want to put some dry leaves and some just some leaf litter in the bottom of that can for thermal regulation as well, for anything that's captured overnight. This is something you really don't want to do if the overnight temperatures are going to be less than 40 degrees. So warmer temperatures are good for overnight. And I'll just show, this is a example. If you look at the one on the left, we do a student summer field course out of UW-Madison, and that's the type of pitfall traps that we use. We use that little bit of wood, and then you can see ours is actually a flower pot that if you go and buy roses at the florist, they're in these pots. That's what we use. And then that black square thing to the right is a cover that just sits over the top of that and is propped up. And then the picture of my daughter's there with American toads. You can see in the background of that photo, you can see another pitfall trap that they just checked and found those in. Okay, just checking time. All right, so I'm going to get through a few slides here on managing for herptiles and what it involves. So managing is going to involve, first and foremost, protecting, enhancing, and/or creating habitat. It also involves choosing land use practices and other management measures that will benefit herptiles. In many cases, it's simply providing a missing element that isn't there. So maybe you don't have the cover that salamanders need. You don't have that down woody debris in your forest. If you could supply that, maybe you'll attract those salamanders. And then also just being mindful about the timing of some of the management practices that you do, whether it's prescribed fire or the timing of your mowing operations. If you can delay those a little bit or raise your cutting height to 8 inches, you can avoid directly impacting herptiles as well. And the timing of your timber harvest as well can be important. So habitat is the key. Its quality and quantity is going to determine the number and the kinds of herptiles found on your land. It is that philosophy of, if you build it, they will come. So if you can preserve or restore native habitats, whether that's forest, grasslands, or wetlands, you'll provide great habitat for wildlife. Just putting in a wetland or a wetland scrape can be super beneficial to amphibians and reptiles alike. That's something that you would need to check with your DNR office, because anything when we're talking about managing water also means regulation. And so really beneficial to wildlife, but it is something that you have to get the appropriate permits for. And DNR is a good source of contact there. And for amphibians and reptiles, we really don't want ponds. You want them to be more shallow. And fish are not, fish are kind of the enemy for amphibians. They eat the eggs and the larvae. And so fishless wetlands or vernal ponds are really important. The more irregular you can make the shoreline, the better. And if you can incorporate structure like dead trees for basking, or perhaps an island or a peninsula, those are all excellent structural features as well. And then prairie habitat, grasslands, are really important for snakes for thermal regulation, and they're a great source of prey. Closed canopy forests that are moist or higher will have higher humidity levels, and those too are really important for the amphibians to stay moist. And some general guidelines for reptiles then is providing habitat for prey species. So you need to have an ample food source. So, and a lot of that cover for small mammals, structure, forest floor is important. Open sunny areas with good ground cover, again, so they can thermoregulate, places to bask, nesting areas. And you might consider managing for nest predators and or protecting turtle nests. So we talked about that earlier as a threat to herptiles is the number of nest predators and providing places to hibernate. You could think about putting in a snake hibernaculum, and there's plenty of resources on the internet to take a look at those, but essentially digging a pretty good pit, maybe 4 feet deep. You want to get some of it below the frost line, and then filling it with large coarse debris, like they've got concrete in there, big logs, stumps, things like that, and then adding smaller debris as you go, and then mounding it up above the height of ground level. And snakes can use that as a place to overwinter. Again, providing lots of cover, hunting opportunities, and sporadic brush piles are good for reptiles as well. The idle fields that you might have, it's a good idea to not have any trees that can serve as perch sites for predators. So if you have open grasslands, you want to remove those trees, not just for herptiles, but those can be predators of ground nesting grassland birds as well. If you have rock piles or the old rock fence lines from farmers clearing the fields, those are excellent examples of cover for lizards and snakes. And then for turtles, the species present are going to depend on the proximity to and the type of water bodies that you have near your property, and then the availability of suitable nesting habitat. One thing with amphibians and reptiles, you really don't want to be mowing the banks of your water bodies, whether that's a lake or a pond or a river. You really don't want to mow up to the water's edge. Maybe one path if you're trying to have access, but for the rest of it, you want to leave that fully naturally landscaped, again, to provide protection. You can maintain and create nest sites, again, putting in basking logs, and then monitoring for nest predators. You could use a trail camera to take pictures of nesting areas for turtles, and if you are having problems with predators. And you can also protect them. The DNR's website has a great fact sheet on building turtle nest exclosures that are large enough in mesh size to allow the hatchlings to leave the nest, but too small for raccoons to get in. And for amphibians, you want habitat to lay eggs. So we want seasonal. Those are, again, like vernal pools or ephemeral ponds. Those are created from the snow melt and spring rain, and they're especially valuable because they're devoid of fish. And again, they warm up quicker. They're shallow, so their water temperature warms up and are important for early breeding species. You can consider the wetland restoration or wetland management we talked about. We just talked about the edges for water bodies. Again, you want to be really mindful about pollutants or herbicides, fertilizer that might be entering your waterways. Use the minimal amount needed to get the job done, and always follow your label directions. As far as around the home, so what can you do? So maybe you own some rural property, but also live in town or have an acre lot. You could reduce the amount of lawn that you mow for herptiles. Again, help give them some protection. It's good for other wildlife and invertebrates as well. Talked about eliminating or reducing the use of chemicals. If you have window wells, they are a common trap for herptiles, whether it's a snake or a salamander or toads. They'll move along the side of the house and fall in, just like that pitfall trap, but we really don't want to do that because we're not monitoring them regularly. So installing a window well cover is really important. Also reducing any food attractants around your home. That's a good practice to begin with because you don't want to deal with nuisance urban wildlife like raccoons or skunks or possum and things like that. But those are also all potential predators of herptiles. So you don't want to leave any extra food or attractants around your home. And then, of course, you can support local and state initiatives that preserve natural landscapes and that promote connectivity of landscapes. That's a great way to help benefit herptiles. And you can support conservation groups and programs. So Turtles for Tomorrow is a wonderful organization that is really devoted to helping endangered and threatened turtle species to stabilize and rebuild their populations. And they work quite a bit with private landowners like yourselves. So if you do happen to know you have wood turtles on your property or Blanding's turtle, I'd reach out to them. They're always looking for more sites where they can develop nesting areas and help those turtles. And then after you've implemented, again, some of these techniques or done some management for herptiles, you're going to want to continue to monitor or basically repeating those inventory techniques so that you can evaluate and tweak your results. Who knows? Maybe you'll make a new discovery and it'll take you in a new path. And then lastly, I'm just going to very quickly go through a few slides here to let you know about some citizen science opportunities. So beyond habitat work on your property, there are other ways that you can help, including just educating your family and friends about herptiles, sharing some of the resources that you've heard about today, and maybe even getting involved in some very specific citizen science opportunities relative to herptiles. So one is the frog and toad survey, which I did talk about earlier as a protocol that you could adapt for private land that you could use on your own. But if you would also like to do it to contribute to the state's survey data, which helps them monitor the status and distribution and long-term population trends of Wisconsin frogs, you can go to this website and you can look to see if there are any survey routes available in your area. And if you're interested, then you could email the coordinator and see if you can't sign up to run some of those survey routes. This survey's been has started in 1984, and it's now one of the longest running amphibian monitoring projects in North America. And then two other ones that are pretty similar in what their goals are, but one is the Wisconsin Turtle Conservation Program, looking to document the statewide distribution and most importantly, high turtle crossing and mortality locations along roads so that they can then come in and promote effective management in those areas to help conserve our turtle species. Similarly, there's also a way or a reporting form to report crossings and road mortalities of frogs and salamanders and snakes and lizards for the same reason. We want to know where these species exist, where they're distributed in the state, and then also understand where these hazards are and what we can do to better protect them. And then lastly, I'll just maybe leave this slide up for a little bit. But these are some of the resources that I used and would direct you to if you wanted to learn more about managing herptiles. There's also frog calls, quizzes, and yeah, I think that's about it. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we have a few minutes here for some questions, Bill.
Yes, we do. There's none of coming in the chat. If you'd like to unmute and pose your question, I've been trying to capture the links and sites you've been mentioning, Jamie. I think I got many of them. I'm looking at your list here, but it doesn't look like I got them all though. You can always check the recording after I post it to, if I don't capture the link in the email that I'm going to send out tomorrow, you can get to these links as well. I was thinking about the woodland owners wanting to promote more reptiles, amphibians on their property, and when you talked about sunlight and needing the sunlight for basking, how does that fit in with like if you have an intact woodland, or do you need to put in openings? Is there more edges? What's your suggestions?
Yeah, I guess my first suggestion would be is to think about a landscape scale. So yes, if you're thinking on your property, you have 40 acres of contiguous forest with no openings. I wouldn't be so quick to go and put in a bunch of openings to create areas where the sunlight's hitting the ground. I would look first at what you have, what your neighbors are doing. You know, is that being provided in the local landscape? If not, then you could think about maybe strategically opening up some areas that places where two habitats are colliding. So either along a waterway, if it's overgrown with shrubs, for instance, wood turtles won't use that area. So to maintain nesting sites for turtles, you actually have to continually fight succession and remove those shrubs. So they have an open area, open sandy soil in the uplands to be able to lay eggs. That's one example. Another, you know, if you wanted to put in a native prairie in a couple of acres, you know, of course, that would open up sunlight. You'd have the grasses for cover and for prey sources. That would certainly encourage snakes.
Yeah, when I talk to people about looking at the landscape, what their neighbors have in the way of water features, it's there's some more context is needed. Like if there's a creek that runs right along the property line, that's one thing. But if it's on the other side of the property, maybe a quarter mile away, is that still a valuable resource for amphibians and reptiles on your property? Or would that be more an incentive to actually add some kind of feature?
Yeah, it would depend on what we're talking about. So reptiles, again, have larger home ranges. The amphibians are going to have a much smaller home range. So if you have no water sources on your property, I guess I would ask, you know, in your woodlands, do you have these vernal pools or ephemeral ponds? So these areas that as the snow melts, it could have just be a little depression. It could be an area where a tree has fallen and you've got that tip up mound and it's collecting water. Some of those little pockets of water like that are really important for those first breeders, spring breeders of amphibians, the chorus, spring peeper, and the wood frogs, because again, there's no fish in them to predate the eggs and they warm up a little bit quicker. So I think you just maybe really need to look at it from a, you know, a landscape scale and have a walk about your property.
What about adding like even a decorative water feature with some running water and a pump in it? How valuable is something like that?
Absolutely. From a wildlife standpoint, adding a little backyard pond, you know, in the back of your in your backyard, or something a little bit larger than that, out on your property is always going to attract more species of wildlife. There are some things that you need to be mindful of in terms of, you know, a pond liner with a steep slope entering in makes it impossible for certain wildlife species to get back out. So the slope of those ponds or that liner that you might put in is very important. And then of course, you have to think about whether that's going to freeze out, you know, if it's deep enough, that there's still some open water at the bottom over winter, or if it's going to freeze solid, that can, you know, be a bit of an issue too. But there's information on wildlife ponds and things like that too. I shouldn't even say wildlife ponds because they really don't. Fish ponds are one thing, and then wildlife wetlands are another. So
Yeah, and I've heard that even adding a few plants to something like that can make a huge
yeah,
difference in the amount of
absolutely.
wildlife it.
Yep.
Yeah, you said there's a guide for that, and you also mentioned that contact if it's anything bigger, it's worthwhile to contact the county, or is that the place to go?
Well, if you are interested in doing evaluating your property for wetland potential, or whether you already have wetlands, or what could you do to put water on the landscape, I would start by going to your Natural Resources Conservation Service, so your NRCS office, because they can pull up maps and they also know the various farm bill programs where you can get cost share assistance for doing some of that work. But they're not the only folks that can do the actual work. But I think between NRCS or talking with DNR to determine what permits are needed would be a good place to start.
That's a wonderful segue to our class next month, where we're going to talk to NRCS and DNR folks about what kind of funding and technical and financial funding is available. So yeah, if you're interested in doing something like that, you can still sign up for those classes. Shameless plug for more classes and more classes. Okay. I don't see anybody unmuted waiting to ask a question. So any last final words before we sign off there, Jamie?
No, not from my standpoint. You're certainly welcome to send me an email. If you have any follow-up questions. Again, Bill, I don't know if you put the Wisconsin Cupboards Project in the chat, but that's another program that you might want to take a look at if you're interested in, again, managing for wildlife. Would love to have you apply for that. So.
I will add that to the email I send out today.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, it's kind of a weird time with, like I said, the cold weather we've been having to think about herptiles, but it's a great time to be doing some of this research and reading and doing some planning for what you can do this spring and this summer.
Excellent. Thanks, Jamie, and thanks everyone for participating, and enjoy the rest of your day.